Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. We aim to bring you the best macro analysis to help you successfully invest in financial markets. For our latest analysis, visit macrohive.com. It's Wednesday, 9th March, and markets are rallying on hopes that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is de-escalating. So I thought it was a great time to have an emergency podcast on the situation. On this podcast, I've got one of the leading market strategists for the region, Timothy Ash, and he'll give his unfiltered view on the situation. And as a reminder, you can get access to all of our analysis from topics like Russia to crypto as a member of Macro Hive. There's normally a charge for monthly membership, but to help you navigate these crazy times, we are dropping our paywall for a week. No credit card needed. So you can visit macrohive.com and claim your free access. Now, onto this episode's guest, Timothy Ash. For background, Tim is a senior EM sovereign strategist at the $125 billion fund Blue Bay. Before this role, Tim was head of senior credit strategy at Nomura International. And before Nomura, he held head of EM research roles at ICBC Standard Bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and Bear Stearns. I should add that Tim has been following Ukraine and Russia for decades and is widely viewed as one of the leading strategists for the region. And apologies, the sound quality and parts of this interview are poor, but hopefully you can still catch everything that he says. Now onto the podcast. So welcome, Tim. It's great to have you on the podcast. It's unfortunately not a great time, but nevertheless, we have to deal with what we have at the moment. You're an expert on Ukraine, Russia. So what's your take on this current situation?
Well, obviously, incredibly challenging, as I guess you probably know and other people. I mean, I worried about a defining war between Ukraine and Russia since 2015, essentially, because I think Minsk 2 was always unimplementable, right? I mean, the Ukrainians signed up to it. They hated it. But they were facing massive military defeats at the time from Ilovaisk and Debaltseve. And the Russians thought they got them, well, literally over a barrel, and thought that they would be forced to accept a federal solution, autonomy for DPR and LPR, federal solution, which would stop its Western orientation, right? The wording, maybe the Germans and the French kept the wording kind of vague, and the Ukrainians don't accept that they accepted a federal solution. Autonomy for them was very loose, sort of decentralization. And, essentially, I guess Putin waited and hoped that it would be implemented as per his idea, and in the end realized that this status quo wasn't working for him, right? I mean, in the end, Minsk 2 allowed Ukraine's continued Western drift, right? Every year that goes by, Ukraine becomes less Russian. I'm not saying it was Russian in the first place, but, its Western drive, it just comes further away from Moscow. And I think Putin realized if he didn't move now, he's lost Ukraine forever. And look, this is not about NATO. It's bullshit. It's not about NATO. It's not about security. The Russians pushed that line. It's not about NATO encroachment. NATO is no threat to Russia. Bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. I always remind people, 2013, no American troops in Europe. 2013, no US tanks in Europe. 2014, Ukraine had no aspirations for NATO. Opinion polls suggest single-digit supports for Ukraine in NATO in Ukraine. Ukraine had no military capability, basically. I mean, the fact that Crimea was taken in a matter of hours. And it was a neutral status already, non-aligned neutral status. Its military doctrine of the Ukrainian military was anti-Western. It was built on the premise that the attack was going to come from the West, not the East. And yet, despite all that, Russia annexed Crimea and invaded Donbass.
And you said, you were worried from 2015 onwards. I mean, how come us in the West, we weren't? So Germany carried on with Nord Stream and so on. The US, I guess, did have some positions on this. But all of a sudden this year, we've had this big intelligence that there's going to be an invasion. But what was happening in this interim period?
Well, we need to ask us, wishful thinking, appeasement, business interests coming first. Look, Russian leverage, Russian money, dirty money, laundromat, all that kind of gig. Russia had a huge PR lobbying machine, lots of Western politicians bought off, all that kind of gig. The serious people, the Chatham House guys, the Fiona Hills, the people that really understood Ukraine and Russia have been warning for this a long time. Unfortunately, our policymakers have preferred to look in the other direction. But look, I always make this point, right? And people used to ask me, what do you think about sanctions in Russia? I always make the point, look, the direction of travel in terms of Russia-Western relations since arguably Putin's Munich Security Council speech in 2007 has been crystal clear, right? And then you had 2008, Georgia. You can go through the list. It's been one way. The messaging for Putin, I think, has been pretty clear. The agenda changed. People didn't want to listen to it. And I think now that they've woken up and smelt the coffee,
Yeah. No, I just need to situate us time-wise because everything's moving day to day. So this is Wednesday, the 9th of March, and we're speaking in the afternoon, 3:30 UK time. I mean, this is one of those types of things. Now, obviously, we had the invasion a few weeks ago. We've had this, what seems to me, quite significant sanctions against Russia, central bank, not all Russian banks, but, some banks and SWIFT and so on. What's your take on the sanction side of things? Do you think it was impressive in terms of how quickly the West put sanctions up? Well, what's your take on that?
Yeah, let's just go back. I think the reality is the West's mismanaged the relationship with Russia. I would say not about NATO enlargement, but about the response to Russian aggression. So sanctions were not tough enough in response to Crimea and the Donbass and Skripal and cyber attacks and all that stuff. We always found excuses not to do stuff. So I think if Iran is 10 out of 10, I'd say we were probably at 2 to 3. And given the scale of what Russia had done, it was non-existent. So the Russians got this message, that we weren't going to do very much. Putin thought he could invade Ukraine and basically he'd get away with it, right? What I expected in response to this, probably a 6 or 7 out of 10. Iran is 10, right? So 6 or 7. I'd say we're probably 8 or 9. And the reason I think that, the reason we've scaled up so much is, firstly, I think the Ukrainians have shamed us all. Zelensky's bravery. And I think people are realizing the scale of the threat. And actually, the Ukrainians are fighting for us, right? They're fighting to defend Western liberal democracy. This is an attack on us. And I think, people realize now the absolute threat from Putin, right? So they were shamed into doing something significant. And I think now what we've seen is, say 8.5 out of 10. No one expected CBR to be something. It's pretty incredible. I remember just an inkling of discussion about it. I think I tweeted about it on like the Thursday or maybe Friday, not really thinking it would happen. Saturday morning, I was getting lots of emails from people in DC. There seemed to be momentum, and it was done by Sunday. Remarkable. But anyway, and now there's a lot of focus on energy. I think where we are, people are critical of ESG, and I'm probably one of them. Look, what we're seeing is SWIFT sanctions, CBR sanctions, major Russian bank sanctions. It's become very, very difficult to transact with Russia. That's the reality. Ruble collapse. Actually, what was interesting about this, that the big losers in all this are Russians. Russians believed the lies of the Kremlin. They thought this invasion wasn't going to happen. Foreigners have basically been reducing exposure to Russia the last 2-3 years because of ESG. Obviously, some guys got caught out, wrong side of it, all that gig. They should have listened to US intelligence, I think. But the guys who didn't were the Russians. So the absolute collapse in Russian financial markets is going to hit Russian business, Russian oligarchs, Russian middle class. It's going to have a devastating impact on those guys. So I think this is mega significant. Major companies, McDonald's and everyone else pulling out. Putin has made kind of Russia almost a pariah. And there's focus on energy, which is interesting. It's now from an ESG perspective difficult to buy, or people don't want to buy oil from Russia. It's difficult to transact. To do the transaction, to trade in oil. So this is, the Russians didn't expect this. It's a devastating blow. I was around in 98. It feels a lot worse than 98. It feels a lot worse than 98 because in 98, it was foreigners who got screwed. Devaluation default is great when the holders of your debt are external. Default devaluation is not a very clever idea when it's actually your own people who are suffering. And I think unlike 98, there was expectations that it was going to happen, that there was a way out. Right, because the IMF were there. What's the way out for Russia? Really, seriously, you've got this massive economic crisis. The reserves have kind of gone with the sanctions. How does Russia get out of this? Right, unless there's a change in politics.
Let's talk about potential paths. So, what's a potential de-escalation path here?
Well, look, the Ukrainians are not going to surrender on their core demands, right? This is for them. They understand this. As I said, it's not about NATO. It's not about neutrality and all that kind of gig. Putin doesn't accept the right of Ukraine to exist and Ukrainians to exist. That seems pretty clear. You read his essay. So for the Ukrainians, it's about their survival. So they're not going to roll over to Putin. They want their territory back. There is this talk about neutrality, but they want neutrality and security guarantees. So security guarantees from Russia are not worth a white piece of Munich paper. Right? The Ukrainians are not that stupid. So it has to be cast iron NATO guarantees of its security. And I can't see NATO really doing that. So I don't know. I think, look, ways out is, you think of scenarios as winners and losers. A war ends because defining winner and defining loser, or wars end because, like the Iran-Iraq war, which went for a decade, the two sides slug it out for a long time and then in the end figure out that there's no winner and they have to come to the peace talks, right? Or there's external intervention that essentially some foreign partner or whatever you want to call it decides that it's gone too long, we need to kind of bang their heads together and come to a solution. I just don't see we're close to any of those right yet.
Yeah. I mean, today, this is Wednesday, 9th of March. I mean, there's all this, the markets are rallying. They think there's some kind of movement to peace. I mean, what do you think about these sorts of moves?
Markets didn't roll throughout this, right? I mean, people don't get it. They don't understand the core of the problem, right? And it's about Ukraine. It's about its survival, its identity, whatever. Again, I don't see Putin still thinks he can win. The Ukrainians still think they can win. The two sides are far apart. I mean, possibly a ceasefire, temporary ceasefire, but a solution that would mean sanctions are off Russia means Russian troops have to leave, right? A full withdrawal, okay, maybe to where we were, 10 days, 12 days ago, but I'm not sure Putin's going to do that. Can the Ukrainians capture the territory back themselves? Unlikely. I mean, Russian troops are not doing a great job, right? I mean, it's been a catastrophe from a Russian perspective. I'm afraid, for me, there has to be political change in Moscow. I mean, something has to change in Moscow to change Putin's calculus. But
you followed Putin for years. I mean, he's not going to step down. It's unlikely for there to be a palace coup, from my understanding, or maybe not. Maybe there could be a palace coup. Do you think there could be a leadership change there?
Possibly not my base case, but I'm not sure it's the 10% probability. I think it's more significant than that. I mean, I think for me, the pursuit of war has been pretty disastrous, right? The planning, the willingness. I mean, I expected a short, sharp sort of Iraq 2003 style where the Russians would use their advantage, which is air power, missiles and artillery, right? To bomb the Ukrainian military into conceding a treaty soon. That was my scenario. I mean, the inability to use their advantage and then the use of land forces, boots on the ground, which plays to the Ukrainians' advantage. I mean, it's a huge military cock-up. In the end, I think they thought the combination of, some use of air power, try and take Kiev quickly, decapitate the administration in Kiev, take Zelensky out, and then the rest would fall. I mean, in the end, look, Russians always misunderstand Ukraine. Right. It's lazy. They think Ukrainians are like them. They're not. I mean, it's interesting about their effort to decapitate the administration in Kiev. Look, one negative about Ukraine in the last 30 years is it's a very diffused political landscape, right? I mean, one of the reasons that they've struggled with development is, you've got Tymoshenko, Poroshenko, Yatsenuk, Zelensky, Poroshenko. I mean, there are all these political leaders. Boyko. They're all fighting like a bunch of cats in a bag. But actually, it's a big advantage now, right? It's an advantage because even if Zelensky unfortunately was taken out, there were plenty of leaders who will stand up. And I mean, again, this idea of Russia's pursuit of this conflict, I mean, bombing civilian targets in the east of Ukraine. The east of Ukraine is the area that if anywhere was going to support a Russian invasion, it possibly would be there because, that's where most primary Russian speakers are. Putin's conduct of this war has united the Ukrainian nation around Zelensky. Remarkable. I mean, for me, the one shot that I remember from this so far was the sight of Yuri Boyko. Yuri Boyko was the leader of the opposition bloc, right? Yanukovych's crew, former Regions outfit, right? He used to be very close to Moscow. There's a picture of him in the Rada stood next to Zelensky's guys. So even the seemingly pro-Russian opposition bloc allied behind Zelensky. So the whole nation is against Putin. So I've been a long-winded, not really answered your question, but just going back to specifics of the question, lots of casualties, lots of body bags going back to Russia. He's fighting a united nation in Ukraine. I think elites are stunned by the financial collapse, the loss of their wealth. So the middle class, St. Petersburg, Moscow, maybe they were anti-Putin anyway. I think within the security apparatus, for me, again, the picture of Patrushev, the Security Council guy, getting lambasted by Putin a couple of days before the invasion was striking. This was an ally of Putin. This was part of the Siloviki. It suggested that there were divisions in the administration. And I would hope that some of those would do some stuff to make sure that Putin backs off. And people also ask me, this idea of will the population rise up against Putin? Well, again, it's not necessarily my base case. And I think the forces of control in Russia are very, very dominant. We've seen all the arrests now, and obviously in recent months, we've seen that as well. But look at Kazakhstan, right? I mean, the protests that we saw in January, extraordinary. No one at all expected those protests. And if you think of the Russian population, again, people generally say, well, they've lived through a lot. They can live through austerity. I'd maybe say this is a different Russian population, right? They've had 20 years of prosperity. They're used to going on a holiday in Turkey. They're used to buying nice property. I mean, the foreign holidays, it's not just elites. It's ordinary Russians who've got used to a reasonably good life. To have that totally taken away from them, I'm not sure they're that up to that.
You mentioned Kazakhstan. Has Kazakhstan, since its independence, has it ever had a popular uprising before?
There's been a few mini ones, but Western Siberia, particularly related to disputes around the oil sector. There's been a few mini sort of Islamist, very minor uprising, but nothing as substantive as that. And I think going back to the Russia story, I mean, opinion polls show very strong support for Putin, but even the Levada poll, which is respected. But I mean, come on, let's face it. If I was leaving Moscow and someone phoned me and said, "Do you like Putin?" Dude, I am going to say, yeah, I love the guy. So I don't think I believe that. But those same opinion polls also show that the population generally are not very happy with their lot in life. They don't like the state. They don't like governance. They don't like corruption. There's an underswell of discontent that Putin has kind of been able to brush over because the balance sheet's been so strong. They've been able to, give Russians relative prosperity and some kind of perspective for growth and all that kind of gig. What's interesting, as I said, that the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg will be hit by the financial sector. The body bags, this will go to ordinary places in Russia. The kind of Ryazan, Tula, Tomsk, Omsk, these kind of places, ordinary cities. And I think that possibly will quickly change people's perceptions of Putin. So I think I wouldn't rule out a significant move against Putin.
Yeah. And now from an investor perspective, when I speak to lots of investors, there's a whole sort of class of investors who are basically saying that Russian assets are distressed. I want to go in and buy. Then there's others that say this Russia conflict, people don't necessarily focus on Russia per se. They think this will be resolved quickly. So we'll get back to the, risk on party more globally. I can go back to buy European equities, US equities. And then there's others who are seeing this conflict as something that's potentially globally destabilizing because, Russia's energy, the shock imparted by Russia. I mean, where do you stand in kind of one of these?
Yeah, I'm in the latter camp. I mean, I think for me, this is a globally systemic event on multiple levels, particularly in terms of Western security. People talk about clash of civilizations. This is a clash of systems. Western liberal market democracy versus autocracy. The American, Jake Sullivan and those guys got it totally wrong. China's not the number one threat to our system. Russia is. And I think there's a recognition now. So sanctions are not going to be, even if Putin decides to drive his tanks out of Ukraine, significant sanctions will remain. The relationship is not going to improve because the West has realized that Putin is a bad actor who is trying to attack our system, right? And Putin himself said this is a war with the West. He's made that pretty clear. So I can't see sanctions moderated.
Well, what about the energy dependence of Europe? I mean, Olaf Scholz has said, we're not going to impose sanctions on the energy side. Europe's stuck here in some ways in terms of...
Well, look, if people like Scholz understand or values our system, our very system, we live here. I mean, investors, our base is, it is Western liberal market democracy. I mean, the big banks, we prosper because we have rule of law. I mean, it is under threat, right? So I think there is now a recognition of that, and there is a willingness to accept backdraft. It's a pain. If you are going to counter this threat, we have to accept there's going to be a cost. And I think there is a realization that this is possibly going to be a long-running confrontation, not just the conflict itself, but the battle to rein Putin in. And we have to, impose a significant cost on it. And the Americans yesterday banned exports of oil. Sure, the Americans don't imports of oil. They don't import very much. The Europeans, I think, made a pretty firm statement yesterday. I mean, the comment that, they're going to reduce energy dependency on Russia by 2/3 by the end of this year. Pretty significant. Whether they can do it's a question mark, but to reduce dependency, to reduce energy imports to zero over the medium term, that's a huge statement and a huge blow to Russia, right? In the end, pretty devastating if that's rolled through. So,
and what do you think about Russia maintaining ties with China, India, the rest of the world? So would that keep them afloat, so to speak?
Well, the China-Russia relationship is interesting. Obviously, Putin made a lot of the Beijing Olympics. He went there, he signed this big treaty. I think the Chinese, in a way, they're quite happy to be out of the doghouse. I mean, remember, 6 months ago, the Americans thought China was the big threat. Now, reality has dawned that it's not, China likes the status quo. Putin doesn't. Right? Putin's a disruptor. The Chinese are quite happy for it to go back to some kind of normality with the Americans. And I think they see a window here. And I think they think, well, we could... If we help the Russians, we're just going to screw ourselves in terms of the Americans will say, actually, we were right all along. You're the enemy, whatever. I think the Chinese think if we can, there's opportunity to work with the Americans to do them a favor with the Russians that maybe could somehow improve that relationship again, right? And change the trajectory. And I think the Chinese are actually a bit concerned by how rash Putin's been, right? I mean, they like stability, order. They don't like things out of the blue. And remember, actually, in previous, if you think of after Crimea and Donbass, Putin was trying to push through the East Siberian pipeline. The Chinese screwed him on that deal. Totally.
Oh, really? I don't know much about that. What happened?
Well, the pricing deal basically was unbelievably advantageous to the Chinese. So, they'll be opportunists. But funny enough, they didn't provide the financing for that deal. So, I mean, they're not going to write big checks, right? And it's interesting that I think Chinese companies are there was this comment that some Chinese companies might be looking at cheap assets out of Russia because of this. I think the Chinese companies were very nervous about getting pulled into US sanctions. And if the Chinese do that, they will be sanctioned, right, as well, through secondary sanctions. So I don't think it's a no-brainer that the Chinese support the Russians here.
Yeah. And do you, things like lifting sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, I mean, do you think that's all in play now, it seems?
Yeah. Look, I think the Americans thought the Chinese were the number one threat. They've realized it's Putin. And, we had this summit for democracy, and there was some recognition that Biden's big agenda was democracy for autocracy. The test of it is this, right? And you mentioned China. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that I think the Americans have realized that actually, if they don't stop Putin in Ukraine, it's a green light for China, say on Taiwan. They'll have no chance of stopping China if they're weak on the Ukraine reaction. So I think there's real commitment from the West. There's real willingness to have pain, to take cost. Maybe just, where it goes from here, I worry now that Putin is desperate, is losing. People spoke about this great tactician. What a genius this guy was. Well, he's not such a genius now, right? He's miscalculated in Ukraine. He didn't think the Ukrainians would fight. He didn't think sanctions would be imposed. He thought fortress Russia meant Russian economy was like beyond touch. Totally wrong. He's got himself in a terrible situation where he's an international pariah.
Who are the allies to Russia now? Are there any allies to Russia? Like, is anyone actually pro-Russia globally or not? I mean, China's kind of playing it cautiously. There's lots of neutral countries, but is anybody supportive?
Not really. I mean, the Venezuela thing is extraordinary, as you said, right? I mean, the fact that Maduro seems to be interested to talk, and the Americans are very eager to somehow get much more Venezuelan oil onto the market. No, I don't think there's any particular allies. I mean, I think Putin's just totally overstepped the mark. I mean, the TV pictures, tell the story, right? And I think, the reaction of Western companies, I mean, the number they're putting out of Moscow, I mean, no one expected what we've seen in terms of the sanctions and the reaction from business, right? And that's, ultimately what the Russians really want to have the same pariah status as Putin. If the direction of travel doesn't change in Russia, Russia is going to be isolated for a decade, right? You mentioned Russian assets. What hope of restructuring? I mean, okay, there's going to be a default, but look, it will be a Venezuela-style scenario. I mean, who's going to negotiate with the Russians? What is the deal? There's no IMF. There's no recovery kind of story.
Yeah. Yeah, I was speaking to a number of people around how do you do like a CDS event? I mean, how do you actually agree on these things? I mean, how do you agree, on restructuring? I mean, who would participate in it as well? I mean,
Putin has totally miscalculated. Russia is going to be a terrible place economically for a decade, to come, right? Unless someone in Russia decides that Putin's not the great guy that that they thought he was, and there's going to be some move against him.
Okay, well, that's great. I mean, I know we only have a short period of time, and in terms of just out of interest, I mean, I follow you on Twitter, but what's your sources for following kind of news on this? Because Twitter seems quite good on this, personally. There's a few people I follow on there.
Yeah, the usual sources. I mean, there's been a lot of people who got it totally wrong, right? People like Fiona Hill, Andrew Weiss is very good. Mike Kaufman, Rob Lee on the military. I mean, Kaufman is superb. Mike Lee is superb on the military side. I follow those. People like Fiona Hill, I mean, they don't do much Twitter, but they do write stuff quite often. They talk sense. There's a lot of people out there. I'm just amazed at the complacency about the Russian story.
Great. Okay. Excellent chatting to you. We'll stay in touch. We might just do another one of these soon, but yeah.
Yeah, cheers, man. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating and a nice comment, and let other people know about the show too. We'd be really grateful. Also, sign up to become a member of MacroHive at macrohive.com. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.